Hello, Jose. It is very nice to meet you there in Portugal. You told me that you are now in the city of Cohimbra, where is very famous University of Portugal situated. And actually, you are the first Portuguese scientist which we are welcome in our unbelievable science journal. And I would like to ask you to start about the Portuguese science in general. How does it look like?
Well, I have a very partial view on Portuguese science in general because my full academic career goes through two countries. So I can speak with some certainties about how a bachelor and master program in science would work in Portugal. I don't know how a postgrad in science actually works because that part of my career was done in the Netherlands. So if you want to talk about how a PhD works in the Netherlands, I can talk about that. And then in the meantime, I returned to Portugal for a second PhD in the humanities. So I don't know how a bachelor and master's in the humanities works, only the postdoc, only the PhD. So I have a partial view of all of these subjects. And as far as science, I mean, I took my degrees in science a long time ago. I don't think things change that much. And it's what you would expect. Well, we are a Western European country, but we're not by far the wealthiest. I mean, recently in Kiev. The quality of life isn't exceptionally different between the two countries. In fact, Kiev, I found, was in comparison to Lisbon, I found in many respects was actually more pleasant than Lisbon. Yeah, in terms of public transportation was much better. Overall cleanliness and organization was much better than Lisbon. So even if there are differences, they aren't unsurmountable. The countries are similar. But the sciences usually it's what you get in slightly poorer countries, which is extremely limited resources, as is obvious, which obviously limits the scope of your practical research. But on the other hand, it does promote a certain excellence is too hard of a word, a certain focus on good theoretical subjects. I was a physicist, so our theoretical physics was very good. Our practical physics, not as good, but not because we had any particular lack of skill, just we didn't have the resources. When you're doing material research, you need expensive equipment, you need raw materials that's you just simply can't come by. And then I understand that anyway, this is what I've been told. There is mainly, I hope I don't badmouth these people too much because they are paying me right now, but there is one main institution that funds the large majority of Portuguese PhDs in all areas of science and even the humanities. And this is an institution that, while beneficial in nature and ultimately positive, I suppose, but it suffers from it's not. I don't want to say it's a corrupt institution because it's not an active form of corruption. It's an endemic form of corruption. It's certain quirks inside, in fact, inside all public institutions in Portugal that allow and expect certain forms of corruption to happen in a way that society at large at times doesn't even perceive them as corruption, but they are effectively corruption. And the company that the foundation that funds most PhDs is called the FCT. It's Foundation for Science and Technology. Is largely instrumentalized by a handful of other institutions, which every year they get the lion's share of all the funding, and everybody else like me, like it's mostly universities in Lisbon who get the most money and people in Coimbra, even though Coimbra is the historical standard for Portuguese academics. We just get these scraps that we manage to get by ourselves. And like, for example, even this very week, the beginning of the week, there was breaking news in Portuguese scholarship that the FCT determines its funding by an open competition. You submit your project, and then a panel of experts in your field is assembled, and then they evaluate all the projects. This week, we learned that one of these open applications, some of the juries selected to evaluate the projects were themselves competitors in that open application, which is absolutely corrupt. It's just people approving their own project. So this is the type of thing that happens. If you manage to navigate this, which is hard if you're an outsider, if you don't have the right last name or you don't have the right supervisor, it gets very hard to get funding. That's kind of the situation in Portugal.
But how Portuguese science is connected with global European Union science?
Our funding is largely European Union funding. So the FCT actually manages European funds. So at this point, I would say academic sciences in general, and I'm including both hard sciences and humanities, largely dependent on European funding. And in terms of, let's say, internal production, while our hard sciences are largely produced in English, so we do participate in the global discussion of science, as science is supposed to be. So I would say it's perfectly integrated. Our only disadvantage would be that your average Portuguese PhD student has fewer opportunities to go to conferences and communicate with other institutes. That this is a bit difficult. But the humanities have a completely different issue, which is, first of all, lack of funding. But this is true everywhere. If we are functioning currently in a capitalist neoliberal system, it's nothing inherently wrong with capitalism. Neoliberalism becomes a problem when it's unrestrained. And the problem is that the humanities, a scientific production in the humanities is not sellable. You create information for the betterment of the individual or the betterment of a community in general, a society. You can't sell an object. It doesn't create an object. So that's completely underfunded because it's seen as a poor investment of the funding that we get. Not only that, but there is a certain culture within the Portuguese humanities, which is, and obviously it's not just the Portuguese humanities, I would suppose you have this in many other places, which is you tend to produce in your own language, which cuts you off from having your work read or appreciated or evaluated by anybody else outside of your own country. So you end up not participating in the global discussion. And that is the tendency in Portugal, and it's almost, I actually have professors who take this as a banner of pride, that they write in Portuguese and they are proud to write in Portuguese, and maybe they should, but they do need to realize that they are excluding themselves from the world, and they seem to be okay with this. I personally am not. I think this is a deep problem that somebody needs to do something.
Mm-hmm. I see. By now, these problems looks very similar to Ukrainian problems in science.
Yeah, I would assume so.
Also, I wanted to ask you about this National Academy of Science of Portugal. Do you have one?
To be honest, I don't think we have anything of that sort. Not to the best of my knowledge. Our sciences and our research in general tends to be organized around small, I would say, microstructures. We call them research institutes, for example, but it's not an actual institute. It's not an actual building. It's just a loose association of people who all subscribe to a certain ideology, and often you don't even have to pay any kind of tuition towards it. In fact, I belong to an institute in Coimbra, which is the study of history and society, something like that. And basically, how that works is all these institutes are registered with the FCT, the foundation that supplies funding, and they receive funding in accordance to the people who are signed up to them, and they may claim more funding and more projects if the people associated with them create more papers and books and all of that. So there isn't a unified something that you call an Academy of Sciences. This doesn't exist. The closest you have, besides these small organizations, is like the Order of Engineering, which is a non-state organization which determines what an engineer is and what he needs to do, and you have this but it's the engineers, it's the ones that come closer to science than you have for judges and lawyers and doctors and all of these things. But we don't have, to the best of my knowledge, I might actually be wrong because I was out of Portugal for a long time, so I'm not entirely sure how things are working around here, but to the best of my knowledge, we don't have anything like a national science anything.
I see. Jose, can you please tell about your interest in experimental physics? What was it? What was your researches in physics?
Okay, so that's a complicated question because I started my scientific career as a theoretical physicist. My bachelor and master's degree was in theoretical physics, but the issue with and this is true of every place, when you are arriving at the final stages of your graduation, when you have to choose a project to dedicate yourself to, you frequently do not choose the project you want. You choose the project that is available. You are dependent on your professors, the research that they're doing, and the spaces they have for you to be supervised by them. So at the final stages of my bachelor, I went into the research which was a lot of fun. It was something. It wasn't a tragic choice. I wasn't contradicted when I did that choice, which was the magnetocaloric effect, which is a field of physics, but it's a fancy word to say we were trying to make magnetic refrigerators. And it's completely, while there is highly complex theoretical work being done in that field, what we were doing was mostly experimental. We were trying to produce samples that had a large magnetocaloric effect for a potential future application in a prototype, something like that. So after finishing that, finishing the bachelor and the master's degree, I applied for funding for a PhD with the FCT in Portugal. I got immediately rejected because funding for the FCT functions through a simple application of a mathematical formula, and if there are several factors which they take into consideration, and if one of these factors fails, you are immediately excluded. So you need to have above a certain average, you need to have a few things, independent of your individual value. They pay very little attention to publications, to actual work that you did, your actual topic of your thesis. It's just, they just look at numbers, they don't care about what might be perceived as inherent value.
How many publications in scientific journals you need to have?
Well,
if you remember that stuff.
Well, for this type of scholarship, for this type of application, the number of publications you have is irrelevant. You have a fixed number of points that you get from your scientific publications, but you get the same number if you have 5 or if you have 50. What they actually pay the most attention to is your average grade of your bachelor degree, which is something that you construct when you're just a little kid. Well, not a little kid, but a kid still. You're just a youngster, and which oftentimes you have different interests, and your final average won't be the best unless you just dedicated your entire 20s to just studying, which I didn't. So just the fact that I have a low average, and I had, I think by the time I applied for my PhD, I had 3 or 4 publications with my name, which for a master's student is quite remarkable. And that was irrelevant. It didn't mean anything. And then eventually, after I got rejected, I tried out for other scholarships, and eventually there was an opening in the Netherlands, in Delft, the Technological University of Delft, where the process of selection actually pays a lot more attention to what might be perceived as inherent merit. They look at your work. They want to know what your thesis was. They want to look at your publications. They want to look at your record. Your grades are irrelevant because your grades come from subjects which don't have anything to do directly with the work that you're supposed to be doing. Unless it's subjects that, like, I was doing magnetocaloric effects, so obviously they care about magnetism and they care about thermodynamics. Everything else, they really don't care about. So it's much more a qualitative evaluation than in Portugal, it's a quantitative evaluation. And that's how I managed to get a PhD in experimental physics, working on the same field of magnetocaloric effect.
I see. And then how this shift, or I would rather say conversion, happened to esotericism studies?
Look, that is a long story, and there were multiple reasons for my change in career outlook. Some of which I might not even remember anymore. It was a gradual construction that probably started right at my first rejection and my first introduction to what, let's say, high academic level physics or high academic level science, what that actually entails. Let's use romantic language, the occult unseen forces that lie behind funding and the direction that science is led to. But ultimately, so the first and most important reason was that doing my scientific research, even though, and I don't want to criticize or badmouth any people who currently study science and are very happy doing so. This is a personal reason. I ultimately, doing that type of research, going to the lab every day, while I was not at all bad at it, I was a very good experimentalist, I think, and that life wasn't unpleasant, but it was not fulfilling either. I found myself simply unhappy doing it. You could lead a very good life, particularly since I was doing this in the Netherlands. You have ample job opportunities that pay very well. You could have a very, very comfortable, good life doing experimental science in the Netherlands. But maybe because I do have a tendency towards romanticism, that type of, the idea of having a job that functions solely as a job, something that you get paid for, but you don't have a real passion for, that just seemed like a wasted life to me. Again, just to me. Yeah, I didn't want to. There's an exercise that I advise people to do is when you die, what will people say in your biography? If somebody writes your biography, what are they going to say? And I didn't want mine to say he studied magnetocaloric effect. I did this. I'm not ashamed of doing it, but that can't be my life. I couldn't do that. I couldn't, again, maybe overly romantic, but I needed something else, something more meaningful to be done. And then there were all the other issues. These were personal issues, but informing this was also, like I said, the gradual awareness of how science works, particularly in a rich country like the Netherlands, where I found there was a very problematic proximity between industry and science. And even though this might seem like a positive thing, because that's what allows for an abundance of fun, but ultimately, there is the old saying that science is neutral, which for a very long time was true, that science happens and apparently develops by its own agency. When you're a scientist, and in an idealized way, you are following the truth. And the truth is the truth. There is no good, there is no evil. It's just the truth. What people then do with it, with that truth, that might be complicated. But this no longer happens in a country like the Netherlands or in any rich country where through the process. Okay, we're gonna have to go a bit back because this is what I found to be an elaborate construct that comes into play right at the beginning of your bachelor and master's degree, which is you believe you are going into the sciences to educate yourself and to engage in the pursuit of truth, be it scientific or even cosmological truth. But what happens is that's not what happens in an education in science. You are not educated, you are trained. There is no purpose in bettering you as an individual, as a contributor to society. You are trained in a particular skill. And the other thing that you are trained in is to follow the funding. Everybody goes into science with most people who go into physics, they go into physics with a romantic dream of learning about the universe, understanding the functioning of materials, of reality, and that is gradually substituted by you are actually, in order to progress in science, in order to progress what you might perceive to be your dream, you are trained to follow the funding, independently of where that funding is coming from, or ultimately what the purpose of your research is. The example of this is, for example, like anybody who has studied physics, I was taught information that can be used to kill people. People who spoke nuclear physics in one way or another knows information that with a particular application can be used to create something very, very bad. I was given this information in my studies, and I never had one single hour of ethics.
That is not right, definitely. That shouldn't be so.
Because having an ethics and having morals, something that will make you question your research and the purpose of it, and the purpose of the people funding you, is detrimental to what is perceived to be your career and an economically prosperous scientific environment. So when I got to the Netherlands, I got to see that firsthand, that the reason why they had so much funding for science was that there was this very close proximity with industry. And while science in its pure form might be considered neutral, industry is not neutral. Industry is there for profit. So where the greatest amount of research is being done, where the greatest developments are being done, are not on the points that a society might look at as more important, an academy might look at as more vital for the understanding of either the world or just our own selves, our communities. It's being directed by where can somebody else who is outside of the academic world make money. And that is a corruption of the academic environment. And I worked, like I said, I was being funded partially by a very large industry. They were trying to make a prototype of a magnetic refrigerator. And again, while we might consider that should this prototype be done by this company, it would be positive for society at large, because it's a technology that doesn't use greenhouse gases, it's ultimately it's a positive thing. But the reason why they were funding this research was not because they had particular environmental preoccupations or society preoccupations. It's simply because environmental issues are hot right now, and this is a way they can make a profit. If this thing is beneficial to the environment, it's purely circumstantial. They don't care about that. And I had an issue with that. I had a serious issue with that, and I was bothered that nobody pointed this out, that when in conversations with my colleagues, who were good people, I don't want to say that they weren't good people, that I wasn't understood. My preoccupation wasn't understood. It was almost foolish to have these ideas, to have these thoughts, and consider these issues of questioning whether your research is vital or not, whether resources are being wasted on your research, whether what's gonna get used for. All of these issues just made me grow increasingly cynical about what I was doing, and helped in me losing my whatever flair or fire I might have for science. It was increasingly I saw it increasingly as a corrupt environment, morally corrupt at least. And the fact that nobody else around me saw this, and I couldn't do that anymore. So when that happens, there are several things that can happen. I'm pretty sure I wasn't the first one to go through this, and you can power through it and end up being a cynical and depressed professional. And you can focus on other things in life. I know plenty of people who, after their PhD, pursue a career in industry as research and development people, and they ultimately hate their job, but they manage to fill their life with something else, like families, or so their job becomes a secondary issue. And they have to have something else in their life to take refuge from the depression that they have at their job. I didn't want to do that type of thing because that still seemed hypocritical. So what I did was throughout this whole process, this enchantment, I did probably not the smartest thing, which was everybody has hobbies. I started focusing increasingly more on my hobbies and less on my work. And I always had an interest in history. It's something that's just history is, I believe, is vital, not just for a society in general. It's vital for the individual. If you know enough history, just walking down the street and looking at how people behave, you do know that those patterns of behavior all have an origin, they have a history, and they have a reason. And this actually makes you a more compassionate person. If somebody says something that you identify as having a historical source and a cultural origin, and you understand what that person is meaning beyond the circumstantial words that they are saying, this makes you a better and more compassionate and understanding person. You get to navigate society a lot better. So I always liked history. I always liked the study of religion and how this impacts history and culture. I always read books on it, academic books. So at that point, my reaction was to for no articulated reason, I just started translating this Portuguese. It's a grimoire, a magic book, a traditional magic book that we have in Portugal. It's called the Book of St. Cyprian, and I started doing that as a hobby, translating it into English.
And now you are the most famous researcher of this Book of St. Cyprian in all over the world.
At this point, I would hope so, because the amount of work I've done on this book in the meantime is quite substantial. I might be the most famous, but I will still say I'm not the only one. And there is one guy, at least one, he's better than me. There's a really great scholar from Galicia, which is the part of Spain that's above Portugal. Felix Castro Vicente, shout out, and he produces such wonderful. But again, he has this issue, which is also common with Portugal. He publishes them in either Spanish or Galician, so I can read them. Unfortunately, most other people can't, so it's a real shame. He writes really good stuff. So I started doing that book, and look, I had scholarly preoccupations, but I was very far from being a scholar of religion or history. And I tried my best to do a critical edition of that book. I think on most of it was successful, but reading it now, knowing what I know now in terms of appropriate methodology for the study of history, and particularly the study of religion and magic, there are some shortcomings in that book, some little silliness that went into it. But I can excuse myself with I wasn't a professional at that time. This was a hobby. But I did that, and very successfully. It got picked up by a publisher, my main publisher, which is Hadean Press, and they were very open and immediately accepted. They wanted to publish the book, and from that on, I did my first humanities conference while I was still a physics PhD. I went to a conference in Portugal to talk about the Book of St. Cyprian, and the experience was quite. It was meaningful. Because I never. This sounds probably not. It won't sound the best. It won't be the best sounding thing ever. But for the first time, when I did that conference, after your talk, everybody there's a period for questions. And for the first time, I've done many physics conferences by then, but for the first time, when the question section came, I had the clear notion that there was nothing nobody could ask me that I didn't have an answer to, which I never had in physics. In physics, in a large international physics conference, you go and you're very proud of yourself and you give your presentation. There is always like a Russian guy or somebody from the former Eastern Bloc in there. You will give your presentation and the guy would just go, yes, that was all very good. We did that in 1957. There's this publication, and he just destroys you. For the first time in my life, I just had a notion, no, nobody in this room knows more about the subject than me. I felt like an expert for the first time. And so that was that for a while, and I did finish my PhD. I know a few people who've had these losses of faith and were unable to finish their PhDs, but I managed to finish it. The paycheck was too good. Dutch scholarship is really amazing. I finished it, and I did my defense. It was January 2014. And by September of that year, I was entering into a master's degree in history, religion, and esotericism in Amsterdam. Luckily, I was doing a PhD in the Netherlands, and that is also the only place where you can actually do a specialization on the topic that I had discovered and I had learned was my understanding of magic and religion. Luckily, I was in close proximity and I managed to make this transition. And again, they care more about, they do qualitative evaluations instead of quantitative. So I could just apply for the University of Amsterdam with a PhD in physics, which is pointless. But just say, look, I already have a publication in the humanities. The talk I gave ended up being a paper. And I did a conference and I published a book, and they just accepted me, no problem. So I did that. It was a lovely period. 2 years that, and I did that with all the scholarship, that master's degree, living in the Netherlands, which is obviously an expensive country. So I was dead broke. But it was still one of the most fulfilling experiences I could have. So I managed to correct a lot of my methodological flaws, And after that, there's no way I'm going to go back to science, although I did try to apply for a job in the Netherlands for only temporarily. I just wanted something to try to replenish my finances. But ended up coming back to Portugal and applying for a second PhD, this time in history, here in very few Portuguese scholars that has ever done serious research into magic in the early modern period, and he accepted me as his student. And I was around here for a while, for 2 years without funding, and very recently I managed to get funding through, I don't know, luck, or other people would say providentialism. I don't know. Eventually, I did manage to get an FCT scholarship, which I was rejected all those years ago, which is why I had to go to the Netherlands. And yeah, that's right now, PhD student in history studying magic in the Portuguese Inquisition. It's a radical transition, took 8 years to do. It's not something I would advise everybody to do. It's when you're a young scholar, early 30s, the 8 years, throwing away 8 years is not an easy choice. But that's what it cost. It cost me all my finances and 8 years of my life, but I managed to redirect towards something that I actually enjoy doing.